Fury, his wolf, had opinions about everything. The weather, the tariffs, the precise angle at which Sky held his fork. But lately, his primary area of expertise was Sky's reproductive system. "Relax the shoulders," Fury commanded, with the unshakable certainty of a celestial body. Sky's shoulders were, at this very moment, bunched up around his ears like two furry, miserable mountains. In Fury's youth, his voice had been one of instinct and wildness. In Sky's kingship, it had become a voice of tactical aggression and territorial pride. In the last 2 years, it had become a self-appointed, deeply unhelpful fertility coach. Sky subtly tried to roll his shoulders back, an act of regal nonchalance that he hoped looked deliberate. He was, after all, at the head of a banquet table 30 feet long, carved from a single petrified ironwood tree. To his left sat Elder Maeve, her face a roadmap of judgments. To his right, his mate, his queen, Amber. "No, not like that. You look like a corpse. Think of something romantic. The bond, our mate, her scent." He inhaled. The dining hall smelled of roast boar, pine torches, and the cloying herbal steam rising from the small clay pot placed pointedly beside Amber's wine goblet. Fertility tea. Again. "Not the tea, you imbecile. Her. Think about Amber." He looked at her. Her hair, the color of spun autumn gold, was braided with silver clasps. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek. She was pretending to listen to an old gamma drone on about wool production, but Sky knew she was miles away. He could feel it through the mate bond, a quiet ache that had become the background music to their lives. He loved her so much it was a physical weight in his chest. Good, that's the stuff. Hold that thought. Project Vigor. Project Potency. Project I am a king who can absolutely produce an heir, thank you for asking. A soft snort escaped Amber. She disguised it as a cough, pressing her napkin to her lips. Her eyes, the color of a forest floor, met his across the table. They were filled with a devastating, soul-wrecking amusement. Their bond was a strange and specific thing. Most mated pairs shared emotions, a warmth when the other was happy, a chill when they were afraid. Sky and Amber got the full broadcast. Every stray thought from his wolf landed in her head like a rock through a window. Every dry observation from her wolf, Tara, arrived in his with the quiet certainty of a tax bill. Healer Alara had once called it an unusually transparent bond. Marcus had called it a surveillance state with feelings. Neither description was wrong. She could hear Fury's terrible coaching. She had heard every word of his 2-year campaign to optimize their reproductive output through posture correction and positive visualization. For 2 years, their most private struggle had been a 3-person show. And the third person was a wolf with the subtlety of an avalanche. From Amber's side of the bond, Tara's voice arrived in Sky's head, flat and uninflected. He is doing the shoulders again. Sky nearly choked on his wine. "A toast," Elder Maeve said, her voice cracking like dry leaves. She raised her goblet. "To the turning of the seasons. Winter's grip may be tight, but spring always follows, bringing with it the promise of new life." Her ancient eyes pinned Sky to his throne. The entire table went quiet. It was the 17th time she'd made that exact toast this month. "All right, big guy, this is it. Your moment. Smile. A kingly smile. One that says, yes, Maeve, I am a veritable garden of fertility, and spring is indeed coming. Don't let the jaw clench. I can feel the jaw clenching. Unclench. Unclench." Sky raised his goblet, the muscles in his arm rigid. He forced a smile that felt like it might crack his face in two. "To new life," he echoed, his voice a low rumble. He took a sip of wine and nearly choked as Amber, his beautiful, treacherous mate, let out a small, helpless giggle. She hit it again, but the damage was done. A ripple of nervous whispers went down the table. The rest of the meal was a blur of similar moments. A council member mentioning how his daughter had just welcomed her third pup. An offhand comment about the nursery wing of the castle needing a good airing out. It was a suffocating, coordinated campaign of hope and expectation. Just as dessert, a honey-drizzled pear tart that Fury noted was high in nutrients beneficial for wolf vitality was being served, a young servant approached the throne, moving with the terrified caution of someone delivering bad news. He carried a small, rectangular package wrapped in plain linen. "A delivery for the king? From the Dowager Queen?" the boy squeaked, bowing so low his nose nearly touched the stone floor. Sky took it. He didn't need to open it to know what it was. His mother's preferred method of communication lately was passive-aggressive embroidery. The first one, a year ago, had been a simple sampler with the word patience. The last one, delivered 2 weeks prior, had featured 2 wolves gazing at a full moon, with the phrase, "Blessings come when you stop trying," stitched beneath them in an alarmingly cheerful pink thread. He unwrapped it. This one was a small, circular hoop. It depicted a shockingly detailed wolf, clearly meant to be him, holding a swaddled pup in its mouth. The stitched text read, "Just relax." "She has a point," Fury offered. "Your tension is audible. I bet your pelvis is tense. We need to work on pelvic relaxation exercises." Sky's grip on the embroidery hoop tightened. The wood creaked. Amber leaned over, her shoulder brushing his. "What's this one?" she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. He showed her. Her lips twitched. "Oh, that's direct." "It's firewood," Sky muttered, shoving it under the table. They escaped as soon as they could, pleading exhaustion. The walk back to their royal chambers was silent. The corridors of Ironhowl Keep, carved as they were from the heart of a mountain, had a tendency to amplify sound. The whispers of the court followed them like ghosts. They passed servants clearing tables, their gazes a mixture of pity and hope. They rounded the corner near the eastern stairwell and nearly walked into 2 of the younger pack wolves, Thatcher and Wren, mid-shift in the corridor. Thatcher was already on all fours, a rangy brown wolf shaking out his fur. Wren was halfway through, one arm still human, his face elongated into something between a grimace and a muzzle. "Patrol shift change, my king," Wren managed, through a mouth that currently had too many teeth. "Apologies." "Carry on," Sky said. It was the kind of thing that happened in a castle full of wolves. The night patrol preferred to run the perimeter in fur. He'd done the same thing himself 100 times. Thatcher wagged his tail once, an involuntary, slightly embarrassing acknowledgement of his alpha, then bolted down the corridor, claws clicking on stone. Wren completed his shift with a crack of bone, shook himself, and followed. Sky watched them go and felt the familiar itch beneath his own skin. He hadn't shifted in 11 days. The restlessness was building, a crawling, skin-wrong feeling that made his joints ache and his temper short. But every time he thought about a run, Fury turned it into a strategic fertility operation, and the joy of it curdled. Finally, they reached the heavy oak door of their chambers. Sky pushed it open and stood aside for Amber to enter. The room was their sanctuary, the one place where he was not a king and she was not a queen, but just Sky and Amber. A fire crackled in the enormous hearth, casting dancing shadows on the tapestries. But even here, the pressure had found them. Sitting on the small table beside the door, placed on a silver tray, was a steaming pot of tea. The scent, that same cloying, hopeful herbal scent, filled the room. Amber stopped dead. She looked at the teapot, then at Sky. The amusement had fled her eyes, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical blow. The silence in the room was heavier than any stone in the mountain. "I don't think more tea is the answer," Fury noted, with a sudden, uncharacteristic flash of insight. "Perhaps a brisk run? We could chase a squirrel. That always clears the head." Sky ignored him. He walked over to the table, picked up the entire tray, teapot, cups and all, walked to the open balcony and tipped it over the edge. It wasn't a kingly act. It was a desperate one. He heard the distant, faint shatter of porcelain on the courtyard stones far below, followed by a startled yelp from a guard, and the hurried scrape of boots on flagstone. He didn't care. When he turned back, Amber was still standing there, her arms wrapped around herself. The firelight flickered, catching the unshed tears in her eyes. The laughter was gone, and in its place, something was breaking. The silence between them was a living thing. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to say the right words, but the right words had been buried under 2 years of the wrong ones. The healer's gentle encouragements, the elder's pointed blessings, his own mother's stitched optimism, until he couldn't find them anymore. She turned away from him toward the fire, and he watched the line of her shoulders curl inward, small and tight. She was disappearing right in front of him, and he didn't know how to stop it. He went to bed that night with her back against his chest, her breathing too even to be real sleep, and the growing, terrible certainty that he was losing her to something he couldn't fight. The next morning, the broken porcelain had been swept away, but the ghost of it remained. Sky found his beta, Marcus Var, staring at the spot in the courtyard where the teapot had met its end. Marcus was a tall, lean wolf, with a face that seemed permanently fixed in a state of weary resignation. He'd been dealing with Sky, and by extension Fury, for 20 years. "Heard there was a bit of a diplomatic incident with the crockery last night," Marcus said without turning. His tone was as dry as summer dust. "The teapot was making aggressive overtures," Sky replied, coming to stand beside him. "I neutralized the threat." "Ah, another delivery from the Pupduction Committee, was it?" Sky grunted in affirmation. A new pot had already appeared outside their chamber door that morning. He'd almost tripped over it. This one had a little note attached. "For vigor." "See? Vigor. That's what I've been saying," Fury chirped. "We lack vigor." "I'm going to declare war on tea," Sky announced. "All tea. Henceforth, it will be a banned substance in this kingdom." Marcus finally turned, one eyebrow raised. "A bold move. The Dowager will be displeased. She single-handedly keeps the chamomile merchants in business." He gestured for Sky to walk with him. "Speaking of displeased, the Badger clan has dammed up the Whisper Creek again. They're claiming it's a ceremonial mound. It's flooding the lower pastures." The Badger clan. A persistent, infuriating thorn in his side. They weren't a real threat, just a clan of belligerently stubborn shifters who communicated primarily through architectural spite. "For the last time, Marcus, it's not a ceremonial mound. It's a pile of mud and sticks. Their leader, Old Man Bristleback, just enjoys watching my Gamma Scouts get their boots wet." "A show of force is required," Fury advised immediately. "A dominant howl, a display of fangs. Or we could build a bigger dam upstream. A spite dam, yes, a monument to our displeasure." "We are not building a spite dam," Sky said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Marcus, long accustomed to Sky responding to silent commentary, didn't blink. "Of course not, my king. That would be undignified." He paused. "The engineering corps did draw up some preliminary plans, though, just in case." Sky sighed. This was his life, a kingdom to run, a badger to out-stubborn, and a wolf who thought international incidents could be solved with competitive construction projects. And beneath it all, the constant, grinding pressure. "Amber is quiet," Sky said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. Marcus was silent for a moment, his face shifting from its usual sardonic mask into something more careful. "The whole kingdom has been holding its breath for 2 years, Sky. It's a wonder she hasn't suffocated." He looked at his king steadily. "How are you?" The question caught Sky off guard. People didn't ask kings how they were. They asked kings what they wanted done. "My wolf has developed a theory that the problem is my posture," Sky confessed, the absurdity of it tasting like ash. He believes if I can achieve a state of regal relaxation, a pup will simply manifest out of sheer respect for my excellent deportment. Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then he said, I'm going to recommend him for a position on the Elder Council. He'll fit right in. Skye managed a weak smile. They walked towards the training grounds, the conversation shifting back to badgers and trade routes and the 100 other duties of a king. But his thoughts remained in their chambers, with Amber's silence and the ghost of a shattered teapot. Fury, meanwhile, had moved on from posture and was now critiquing his stride. Your gait is too heavy. It suggests a burdened mind. We need a lighter, more hopeful stride. Think spring morning. Think sapling. You're walking like a grizzly with a bad back. Skye physically put his head in his hands. One day, he muttered to Marcus, I'm just going to let him take over for a full day. Let's see how the kingdom fares under the rule of King Fury I. Our new foreign policy will be chasing squirrels, and our primary domestic policy will be mandatory naps. Peace in our time, Marcus deadpanned, but as they reached the barracks, his expression grew serious again. Talk to her, Skye. Not as a king, just as her mate. The advice was sound. The problem was, every time he tried, his wolf turned it into a horribly narrated theatrical production, and Amber's fragile composure shattered into another fit of helpless, heartbreaking laughter. He felt trapped between his duty, his mate's pain, and the well-meaning, catastrophic chaos in his own head. And he had no idea how to fix any of it. Amber sat at the desk in her solar, a stack of unsigned trade agreements to her left and a perfectly sharpened quill in her hand. The late morning sun streamed through the leaded glass, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She was supposed to be reviewing the new tariffs on Riverstone from the Granite Peak Pack. It was the sort of detailed, diplomatic work she usually loved, a puzzle of clauses and compromises. Today the words swam before her eyes, meaningless black squiggles on parchment. Her own wolf, a steady, earthy presence she called Terra, was unusually quiet. When she did speak, her voice was a low, deadpan rumble, a stark contrast to Fury's constant, shouting narration. The ink is drying on the quill, Terra observed. You have been holding it for 11 minutes. The trade agreement remains unagreed. Amber sighed and set the quill down. She pushed the papers away. She couldn't focus. Her mind kept replaying the scene from last night. The forced smiles, the suffocating hints, the final desperate crash of the teapot. Skye's act of rebellion had been for her, she knew. But it hadn't fixed the ache in her chest. It had only highlighted it. A soft knock came at the door. My queen? It was her lady-in-waiting, a young she-wolf named Lyra. Healer Alara is here for your appointment. Amber's stomach tightened. Alara, the pack's head healer, a kind woman with knowing eyes and gentle hands who had been overseeing their efforts. More consultations, more pungent herbal brews, more charting of cycles and temperatures, more hope curdling into disappointment. The worst part was what Alara had told them 6 months in. There was nothing wrong. No condition, no imbalance, no reason the healers could find. They were both healthy. The mechanics were sound. It was simply not happening. Somehow, the absence of a reason was crueler than any diagnosis would have been. There was nothing to fix, nothing to fight, nothing to blame except themselves and whatever the moon decided. Tell her I'm not feeling well, Amber said, her voice strained. Ask her to leave today's preparations with you. You are feeling well, Terra stated, a simple, unarguable fact. You are feeling sad. They are different conditions. Thank you, Terra. Very helpful. I am always helpful. You simply don't enjoy the help. Lyra hesitated. Of course, my queen. Her footsteps retreated down the hall. Amber stood up and walked to the hearth. The fire was burning low. A few minutes later, Lyra returned with a small cloth-wrapped bundle. The familiar cloying scent of dried moon petal and willow root filled the air. Amber took the bundle, her hand trembling slightly. For a moment, she just held it. This was her life now. A collection of hopeful remedies and failed attempts. A public performance of fecundity with no closing act. The kingdom didn't see her as a diplomat, a strategist, a queen who had personally brokered the Granite Peak trade accord and kept 3 border disputes from becoming wars. They saw her as a barren field that refused to bloom. The wound of inadequacy was not new. It was old and deep, worn smooth by years of carrying. She'd been a quiet, observant pup in a loud, boisterous family, the youngest of 5 siblings, all of them louder, faster, more visibly wolf than she was. Her brothers had shifted early and spectacularly. Her sister had presented as a dominant alpha at 14 and had led her first patrol at 16. Amber had been the one who read in corners, the one who noticed things, the treaty clause that didn't quite add up, the visiting alpha whose scent shifted sour when he smiled. But noticing things didn't earn you a place in a pack that valued action. She had built herself into someone who mattered through patience and precision and the slow, quiet work of understanding people. And then she had met Sky. And the mate bond had been the first thing in her life that had simply said, "You, exactly as you are enough." Now even that certainty was crumbling. She looked at the bundle. Then, with a sudden, sharp movement, she tossed it into the fire. The dried herbs caught instantly, flaring up with a bright, angry hiss and a puff of scented smoke. "That seems counterproductive to the stated goal," Tara noted calmly. "The stated goal is making me miserable," Amber whispered to the empty room. "The stated goal is tearing us apart." She watched the last of the herbs turn to ash. The fire popped and settled, sending a curl of moon petal smoke up the chimney. Then she stood, crossed the room, and pulled the Granite Peak trade agreement back in front of her. The quill was still wet enough. She read the disputed clause, the one over Riverstone extraction rights that had stalled negotiations for 2 months, and saw, with the quiet clarity that always came to her when she stopped trying to force it, exactly where the compromise lived. She drafted the amendment in 12 minutes. Both sides would concede on volume caps in exchange for a shared waterway maintenance fund. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of thing that would make the court whisper in admiration, but it would end a fight that Sky's trade ministers had been fumbling for weeks, and the Lower Valley farmers would stop losing their irrigation to contractual gridlock. She signed it, sealed it, and set it on the outgoing tray. Then she sat back and stared at the fire. The herbs were ash. The agreement was done. Neither thing had fixed the emptiness inside her. A decision, hard and clear, settled in her heart. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't keep performing this role. The pressure wasn't just from the court or Sky's mother. It was from herself. The desperate, clawing need to fulfill this one specific duty. She had to know if what they had, just the 2 of them, was enough. For him. Because if it wasn't, then the foundation of their bond was a lie. If his love for her was conditional on her ability to produce an heir, then the crown was a cage, and their marriage was just a contract. She had to know, even if the answer shattered her. She spent the rest of the day in a haze, moving through her duties with a brittle, automatic grace. She smiled at courtiers, nodded at guards, and approved menus she didn't read. All the while, the question she needed to ask grew heavier and heavier inside her, a stone she had to find the strength to lift. Late in the afternoon, the weight became unbearable. She left the castle through the kitchen passage, nodded to the cook's boy who was hauling a sack of onions, and walked into the tree line behind the eastern wall. The air hit her like a wall of cold clarity, pine, wet earth, the distant metallic tang of snow still clinging to the upper peaks. She didn't make a decision to shift. Her body made it for her. The change came hard and fast, driven by something older than thought. Bones cracked and reformed. Skin rippled. And for one searing moment, the pain was everything. And then it was over, and she was Tara, and Tara was her, and the world was made of scent and sound, and the simple, enormous relief of being in the right shape. She ran, not for exercise, not for duty, not for anyone. She ran because her wolf body needed the ground under its paws the way her human lungs needed air. Through the birch stands where the bark smelled of paper and cold, along the ridge where the wind carried the scent of the valley, wood smoke, sheep, the mineral bite of the creek. She ran until the human thoughts couldn't keep up, until there was nothing but the rhythm of her stride and the steady percussion of her heartbeat, and the vast, uncomplicated honesty of being an animal that knew exactly what it was. She stopped at the edge of a frozen pond. Her reflection stared back at her. Brown fur, steady dark eyes, breath misting in white plumes. She was still in there, the woman with the question. But out here, in this form, the question felt smaller, survivable. She lay down in the snow and pressed her chin to her paws. The cold seeped through her fur and into her bones, and she let it. She stayed until the light began to fail. Then she rose, shook the snow from her coat, and ran back to the castle. By the time she reached the kitchen passage, she was human again, shivering and bare and covered in pine needles, wrapping herself in the cloak she'd stashed behind the woodpile for exactly this purpose. The question hadn't gone away, but she could carry it now. That evening, she found Sky on the balcony of their chambers, staring out at the snow-dusted peaks. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. He didn't turn as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her. Through the bond, she caught the faint echo of his wolf. Maintain casual posture. Do not appear anxious. And her heart clenched with a tenderness so fierce it hurt. Marcus thinks I should build a spite dam, he said, his voice low. Does he now? Amber came to stand beside him, wrapping her arms around his. He was so warm, so solid, a bastion against the world. But was he a bastion for her, or for the idea of a future she might not be able to give him? Fury is convinced it's the only language the Badgers will understand. Architectural dominance. He turned, his hands finding her waist. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were full of concern. You shifted today, alone. He'd smelled it on her, the pine, the cold, the specific musk of a wolf who'd run hard and long. Of course he had. I needed to think, she said. It was the truth. And you threw the herbs in the fire. They were cluttering up the place, she said, trying for levity. It fell flat. Amber, he started, his voice thick with 1,000 unsaid things. He leaned in to kiss her. It was a familiar, comforting gesture. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like a prelude to the performance they were both so tired of. And as his lips met hers, Fury, right on cue, decided to direct the scene. Okay, showtime. Let's set the mood. Deepen the kiss. A little more passion. Think, founding a dynasty. Remember the pelvic relaxation exercises? Breathe in, breathe out. Visualize a wolf pup. A small, adorable wolf pup. Not a badger, Sky. For the love of the moon, why are we thinking about old man Bristleback's stupid whiskers right now? A choked sound escaped Amber's throat. It started as a laugh, a desperate, bubbling thing she couldn't contain. She pulled back, pressing her forehead against his chest as her shoulders shook. The laughter was sharp, edged with hysteria. Sky went rigid. Amber? The laughter died as quickly as it came, leaving a hollow, aching silence in its wake. It was replaced by a single, hot tear that slid down her cheek and soaked into the fabric of his tunic. She looked up at him, her face pale in the twilight, her expression stripped bare of all pretense. The moment had arrived. Sky, she said, her voice trembling but clear. Stop. Just stop everything. He looked lost, his hands hovering uncertainly in the air between them. The usual confident authority of the Alpha King was gone, replaced by the simple, stark fear of a male who feels his mate slipping away. The chaos in his head had finally, mercifully, fallen silent. I need to ask you something, Amber whispered, her gaze locked on his. And I need you to tell me the truth, not the king's truth, your truth. She took a shaky breath, gathering all the frayed ends of her courage. I've stopped the teas. I've stopped the healers. I'm done. I can't keep trying to be something I might not be. Her voice broke on the last word. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. If this is it, if it never happens, no heir, no pup, just us, is that enough? The question hung in the cold mountain air between them, fragile and immense. It was the most dangerous question she had ever asked. In his silence, she could feel the fate of their world, their love, their future, balancing on a knife's edge. Her own wolf, Tara, had gone utterly still within her, a silent, waiting shadow. For the first time in 2 years, the cacophony in Sky's head ceased. Fury, his boisterous, chaotic, ever-present wolf, went completely and utterly silent. The absence was so sudden, so total, it was more shocking than any shout. It was the silence of a wolf recognizing true, profound pain in its mate, a pain that no amount of coaching or commentary could fix. It was the silence of respect. Sky stared at Amber, really seeing her for the first time in months, not as the queen who needed to provide an heir, not as the other half of a problem to be solved, but as his mate. The woman whose laughter was the only music that mattered, whose scent was the only true north he'd ever known. He saw the deep, terrified vulnerability in her eyes, the wound she had just ripped open for him to see. He saw the shame and the fear that he, in his obsession with duty, had helped put there. And it broke his heart. He thought of her as he had first known her, the quiet girl at the border summit who'd said almost nothing for 3 days, and on the 4th day had walked into a room full of shouting alphas and laid out, in 6 calm sentences, the compromise that ended the Granite Peak water dispute. He'd marked her before the week was out, not because a bond told him to, because she was the most remarkable person he'd ever met, and the thought of her walking out of that summit and back out of his life was physically unbearable. She was still that person. She had always been that person. And he had let 2 years of pressure make her forget it. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. His thumb gently wiped away the tear track on her skin. His touch was no longer uncertain. It was firm, grounding. Amber, he said, his voice rough with emotion. He wasn't a king. He wasn't an alpha. He was just a man who loved his wife. You were enough before I wanted an heir, he said, his voice low and fierce, each word a vow. You'll be enough if we never have one. He pulled her closer, his other arm wrapping around her waist, holding her as if he could physically absorb her pain. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent, apples and winter mornings, and the clean, sharp smell of her own unique magic. I didn't mark you for a bloodline, he whispered against her temple. I didn't choose you to secure a dynasty. I marked you because the world makes no sense when you're not in it. You are not a duty. You are the reason for everything. The confession, so simple and so absolute, shattered the last of her control. A sob tore from her throat, a sound of grief and relief all at once. She clung to him, her face pressed into his chest, and wept. She cried for the last 2 years of pressure, for the feeling of failure, for the fear that she was losing him. And she cried because he was still there, holding her, his love an unshakable mountain around her. He just held her, rocking her gently as the sun dipped below the peaks, casting the world in shades of purple and gray. He murmured her name, whispered reassurances into her hair, and let her cry until the tears ran dry. Inside his head, the silence from his wolf continued. It was a sacred space, a quiet vigil held for the breaking and mending of a bond. Fury understood. The competition was over. The goal had never been a pup. The goal was her. It had always been her. Finally, Amber's sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. She leaned back, her hands still clutching his tunic. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, but for the first time in a long time, they were clear. The fear was gone. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I know," he said, his own voice thick. "I'm sorry. I got so lost in what the kingdom wanted, I forgot to listen to what we needed." He leaned down and kissed her, a soft, tender press of lips. There was no agenda, no expectation. It wasn't a prelude to anything. It was just a kiss. It was just them. "Just us," he said against her mouth, echoing her earlier fear and turning it into a promise, "is more than enough." She smiled, a real, watery smile that reached her eyes. "Good, because I was about to suggest we abdicate and go raise sheep. They seem less judgy." A laugh rumbled in his chest, the first genuine one in what felt like an eternity. Fury would try to organize them into a military battalion. The mention of his wolf was easy now, not a source of tension. Amber laughed with him. Through the bond, she could feel Fury stir, not with advice, but with a quiet, rumbling purr of contentment. Her mate was happy. The pack was safe. All was right. That night, they didn't talk about heirs or legacies. They talked about trivial things. They talked about Marcus's hopeless pining for healer Alara. They talked about building a spite dam just to see the look on Old Man Bristleback's face. They fell asleep tangled in each other's arms, the suffocating weight of expectation finally lifted. The world had shrunk to the size of their bed, and for the first time in 2 years, it felt big enough. The shift in the castle was subtle at first, then undeniable. It began with the king and queen. They started laughing again, real laughter that echoed in the stone corridors. They held hands during council meetings. The king stopped looking like he was carrying the weight of the mountain on his shoulders, and the queen's eyes regained their sparkle. The fertility tea stopped appearing outside their door. After the 3rd morning in a row it was found untouched, Elder Maeve seemed to get the message. The court's whispers didn't vanish, but they changed in tone, from hopeful expectation to confused observation. And then there was the badger situation. It was Amber who solved it. She'd been reviewing the original complaints, not the military summaries Marcus had been filing, but the actual correspondence from Old Man Bristleback himself. His letters were atrocious, misspelled, belligerent, written on what appeared to be birch bark. But beneath the bluster, she found something Sky's scouts had missed entirely. The badgers weren't damming the Whisper Creek out of spite. They were damming it because the creek's new course, diverted 3 years ago by Sky's own irrigation project, had flooded their ancestral burial grounds. They weren't being difficult. They were grieving. Amber rode out to the badger camp alone, over Marcus's strenuous objections and Fury's apoplectic internal howling. "She is undefended. This is a tactical nightmare. The badgers could have catapults." She spent 4 hours sitting on a log with Old Man Bristleback, drinking terrible bark tea and listening. She came back with a signed agreement. The creek would be rerouted through a secondary channel that bypassed the burial grounds entirely. The badgers would dismantle the dam. Old Man Bristleback had also, inexplicably, sent her home with a jar of pickled mushrooms and an invitation to his granddaughter's naming ceremony. Sky stared at the signed agreement, then at the mushrooms, then at his mate. "You just ended a 2-year territorial dispute," he said slowly, "with a log and some tea." "Terrible tea," Amber corrected. "The worst tea I've ever had." and he didn't shut up for the first hour. But once he did, she shrugged, he just wanted someone to listen. Through the bond, she felt Fury processing this development. There was a long, loaded silence. Then, I suppose diplomacy is also a valid strategic approach, though I still think the spite dam had merit. Sky laughed, a real, helpless laugh, and pulled her into his arms. Sky and Amber were rebuilding their world piece by piece. One afternoon, he canceled a meeting with his trade ministers. "The tariffs can wait," he announced to a stunned Marcus. "My mate and I are going for a run." They fled the castle, leaving the suffocating stone and ceremony behind for the crisp, wild freedom of the forest. The shift was a release, a joyful explosion of pent-up energy. Bones cracked and reformed, skin gave way to fur, and human concerns dissolved into the glorious simple reality of being a wolf. Sky's wolf form was massive, a thundercloud of dark gray fur with eyes like chips of flint. Fury, finally allowed control, was pure, unadulterated chaos. He bounded through the snow, sending great plumes of it into the air, his tail wagging like a metronome set to a frantic beat. The world was scent and speed and the electric joy of cold air rushing through fur. Prey smell drifted from the underbrush, squirrel, sharp and acrid, and every muscle in his body oriented toward it with a single, blazing imperative. Chase. Amber's wolf, Tara, was sleeker, her fur the color of rich soil, her movements economical and graceful. She let Fury have his zoomies, watching with the patient stillness of a wolf who had absolutely no intention of chasing a squirrel. Fury forgot the squirrel the moment Tara moved. She was warmth and earth scent and the deep gravitational pull of pack, bond, mate, home. He circled her, nipped playfully at her heels, his whole body vibrating with the need to run beside her. She ignored him for a solid minute, long enough for his excitement to reach a pitch that was nearly painful. Then, with a sudden lunge, she was off, a brown streak against the white snow. The race was on. They tore through the trees, a whirlwind of gray and brown. There was no goal, no prize. It was just the pure, exhilarating joy of running side by side, their paws pounding a matched rhythm on the forest floor. He was faster on the straightaways, his powerful legs eating up the ground. She was more agile, weaving through the dense undergrowth with effortless grace. He finally caught her in a small, sun-dappled clearing, tackling her in a move that was less kingly and more puppy-like. They rolled in the snow, a tangle of limbs and fur and snapping jaws that held no heat. He pinned her, his massive form covering hers, and panted triumphantly. Tara simply licked his nose. The action was so unexpected it completely short-circuited his entire being. He scrambled off her, shaking his head as if to clear it, and sat in the snow looking bewildered. They lay there for a long time, side by side in the snow, their breath misting in the cold air. The silence was comfortable, filled with the quiet communication of the bond. Not words, not thoughts, but something deeper. The simple, uncomplicated companionship of two wolves who belonged to each other. This was what they had been missing. Not the formal ceremonies, not the shared bed, but this, being wolves together with no agenda at all. Back at the castle, they became a team. When his mother's next embroidery arrived, a truly baffling piece depicting a bee pollinating a flower with the words, "Be fruitful," they didn't hide it. Amber framed it and hung it in the privy. They started a betting pool with Marcus on what the next one would say. Marcus put 5 silver pieces on "A watched pot never boils." Amber guessed something with eggs in a nest. Sky, feeling cynical, bet on a simple, elegantly stitched question mark. Evenings changed. Where once they'd gone to bed in the tense silence of another failed expectation, now they lingered. They played cards by the fire, a game at which Amber cheated shamelessly and without remorse, and which Fury considered a personal insult to his competitive legacy. They shifted in the evening sometimes, curling together on the bearskin rug in front of the hearth, his massive gray wolf draped around her smaller brown one, the fire warming their fur. It was the kind of simple, domestic intimacy that had been stolen from them by the weight of expectation. Now they were taking it back, one quiet evening at a time. The pressure hadn't vanished, but they had built a wall against it, a wall made of shared laughter and quiet reassurance. They were no longer victims of the kingdom's hope. They were partners, facing it together. And that made all the difference. Life settled into a new, gentler rhythm. 3 months passed. The snows began to recede from the lower valleys, and the first green shoots of spring poked through the thawing earth. The Badger clan, true to Amber's agreement, dismantled their dam and sent a formal, if barely legible, letter of thanks. The kingdom breathed a collective, if confused, sigh of relief. It was on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday that Amber first noticed it. She was in the kitchens, consulting with the head cook about the menu for the upcoming spring equinox feast. The cook, a portly man named Alistair, was proudly displaying a side of smoked river salmon. The smell hit her like a physical force. It wasn't a bad smell. It was a rich, savory, delicious smell. But it was much. It was so overwhelmingly, intensely salmon that her stomach did a slow, nauseous roll. "Exquisite, isn't it, my queen?" Alistair beamed. "It's very pungent," Amber managed, taking a subtle step back. "The fish is loud," Tara observed from the quiet depths of her mind. It wasn't a complaint, just a statement of fact. Amber had never known her wolf to describe a smell as loud before. She dismissed it as a fluke. But then it kept happening. The scent of leather from the bookbindery was suddenly a thick, choking fog. The perfume worn by one of her ladies-in-waiting, a scent she'd always found pleasant, now gave her a headache. And she was tired, so tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had her longing for a nap by mid-morning, even after a full night's sleep. She didn't dare to hope. The cycle of hope and disappointment had been so brutal, she was terrified to start it again. It was probably just stress, or a lingering winter malady. She told herself that, firmly, and she almost believed it. "You are not sick," Tara rumbled. There was a new quality to her wolf's internal voice, a low, constant hum of contentment, like a cat purring. Something had shifted in Tara's attention, a deepening of focus, a turning inward that Amber couldn't quite name. The world is simply turning up its volume. Meanwhile, the castle's primary B-plot was reaching its own crisis. Marcus, Sky's ever-patient beta, was in a state of quiet turmoil over healer Alara. He was hopelessly, deeply in love with her, but his devotion to his duties as beta meant he was perpetually canceling their plans. Sky found him glowering at a stack of patrol rosters. "She says I have no work-life balance," Marcus grumbled, not looking up. "She suggested I meditate. Me. Meditate. Can you imagine?" "Fury suggests you try a courtship howl," Sky offered, leaning against the doorframe. "Preferably from the highest castle turret. He says it's a classic for a reason." "If I howl from the turret, it will be because I've finally thrown myself off it," Marcus sighed. "She deserves someone who can at least make it to dinner on time." "She deserves someone who would move mountains for her," Sky corrected gently. "You just happen to be busy moving actual mountains for the rest of us. Maybe just cancel the patrol inspection. The world won't end." Marcus looked up, shocked. "Cancel an inspection? But it's on the schedule." "Schedules can be changed," Sky said, thinking of his own cancelled meetings and the glorious, unscheduled afternoon he'd spent as a wolf with his mate. "Go, take her to dinner. Fury has some thoughts on appropriate conversational topics, but I strongly advise you to ignore all of them." The irony was not lost on Sky. For 2 years, he'd been the one failing at balance, letting his duty as king eclipse his role as mate. Watching Marcus struggle with the same problem, the same stubborn belief that doing his job well enough would somehow make everything else fall into place, he realized how far he and Amber had come. Their crisis had, in its own strange way, healed them. A few days later, Amber woke up with a jolt. The sun was barely gracing the horizon, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and orange. It wasn't a sound that had woken her. It was a feeling. A deep, primal certainty that bloomed in her chest like a fist unclenching. Tara was awake and alert. "Something is different," she said, and for the first time there was an edge of wonder in her deadpan tone. "The bond feels wider." Amber lay still, her hand drifting down to rest on her stomach. She closed her eyes, focusing inward. The nausea, the fatigue, the heightened senses, they weren't random symptoms. They were a pattern. A song she was only now beginning to hear the melody of. She didn't let herself think it, not yet, not until she knew. She slid out of bed, careful not to wake Sky. She dressed quickly and slipped out of their chambers. She didn't go to her solor or the kitchens. She went to the healer's wing. She found Alara grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. The healer's hair was loose around her shoulders, and there was a small, private smile on her face that suggested Marcus's dinner had gone better than anyone expected. Alara looked up, her expression gentle. "My queen, I did not expect you." "Neither did I," Amber admitted. She took a deep breath. "Alara, I think I might be—" She couldn't say the word. To say it was to hope, and to hope was to risk the falling. Alara didn't need her to. The healer's eyes, trained to see more than the surface, softened with a dawning, wondrous light. She put down her pestle and took Amber's hand. Her touch was warm and steady. "Let's find out," she said softly. The confirmation came quietly, a series of simple questions, gentle hands, Ilara's knowing eyes. When she was done, she sat back, and a smile broke across her face, so bright, so unguarded, it seemed to light up the whole room. "Congratulations, my queen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "About 6 weeks along, I'd say. The spring is indeed bringing new life." Amber just stared at her. The words didn't seem real. She felt a wave of dizziness and sank onto a nearby stool. Pregnant? After all this time? After they had given up? After they had decided that just the two of them was enough? "I knew it," Tara said, her voice a low, satisfied hum. The fish was too loud. Tears welled in Amber's eyes, but these were not the tears of grief or frustration she had shed on the balcony. These were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. A laugh bubbled up, light and free. It was real. It was happening. And it had come not because of the teas, or the healers, or the posture exercises, or the pelvic relaxation regimen. It had come after they'd stopped trying, after they'd chosen each other over the expectation. As if the universe had been waiting for them to want each other more than they wanted what they were missing. She walked back through the castle in a daze, the secret a warm, glowing coal inside her chest. The world looked different. The tapestries seemed brighter, the stone walls less imposing. Everything was sharper, more vibrant. She wanted to run to Sky, to shout the news from the battlements. But she held it close, savoring it for a few more hours. This news was theirs, born not of pressure and duty, but of love and acceptance. It deserved more than a shouted announcement. She spent the day carrying the secret like a fragile, precious thing. Every time someone spoke to her, a courtier asking about the equinox menu, Lyra offering to bring her tea, she declined with a smile that confused the poor girl entirely. She felt the knowledge humming inside her, a private melody only she and Tara could hear. In the afternoon, she went to the small cedar-lined chest at the foot of their bed. Inside, tucked away beneath her winter cloaks, was a relic from the time of desperate hope. Months ago, in the depths of her sadness, she had found a brief respite in knitting. She had knitted one perfect, tiny, impossibly small sock out of soft gray wool. A prayer made of yarn. When the next month had brought another disappointment, she had hidden it away, unable to look at it. She held it now. It was so small, so absurdly, heartbreakingly small. Her vision blurred, and she pressed it against her lips and breathed in the faint scent of cedar and wool and the ghost of the hope she'd been too afraid to hold. Now she knew exactly how she would tell him. The king would get his heir, the kingdom would get its future. But first, her mate, her Sky, would get a sock. That evening, Amber arranged for them to dine alone in their chambers. No council, no elders, no prying eyes. Just a small table set before the roaring fire. Sky was in a good mood. Marcus had finally taken his advice and had a disastrous, but apparently successful, dinner with Alara, which had involved accidentally ordering jellied eel and spilling wine on a visiting dignitary. Alara, by Marcus's own bewildered account, had laughed so hard she'd snorted, and then they'd talked until the candles burned down to stubs. "He's hopeless," Sky was saying with a grin as he sat down. "But she seems to find it charming. Fury is drafting a formal apology to the dignitary on his behalf. It includes an offer of territorial concessions and a ceremonial squirrel." Amber smiled, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Let him. The dignitary is a pompous old goat." She waited until the servants had brought the main course, roast pheasant, a favorite of Sky's, and departed, leaving them in the warm, intimate glow of the firelight. The small gray sock was tucked into the pocket of her dress. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. Sky was talking about the Badgers again, something about them sending a formal invitation to Old Man Bristleback's granddaughter's naming ceremony, and Fury's outrage that a Badger naming ceremony might have better catering than his own. He didn't notice her silence at first. She took the sock out of her pocket. It looked impossibly small in her palm. She reached across the table and placed it gently on the polished wood of his dinner plate, right next to the pheasant. He stopped mid-sentence. He stared at the sock, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked at her, then back at the sock. "A hat," Fury declared in his head with profound confidence. "It is a tiny hat. For the bread roll. An interesting, if impractical, custom. Is she starting a new fashion?" From Amber's side of the bond, Tara's voice arrived, bone dry. "It is not a hat." Sky opened his mouth to ask what on earth she was doing. But before the words could form, the scent hit him. It wasn't the sock, which smelled only of cedar and wool. It was Amber, her scent, the one he knew better than his own. It was still apples and winter mornings, but now there was something else woven through it, something new, a soft, sweet, milky undertone. The scent of new snow on a quiet dawn, the scent of life. Fury went from confused to catatonic to utterly volcanically ecstatic in the space of a single heartbeat. The realization crashed through Sky's mind, not as a thought, but as a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered wolf instinct. "Wait, hold, no, the scent, it's wider, it's new. Apples and winter and a sapling, a new moon, a pup, our pup. Ah!" The howl that ripped through the room was not internal. It was a physical, visceral sound that tore from Sky's human throat, a sound of such shocking, primal joy that it rattled the glass in the window panes and sent a fork spinning off the table. It wasn't a king's proclamation. It was a wolf's triumphant cry to the moon, to the world, to the stars. His whole body had gone rigid, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned, and the sound coming out of him was something no human throat should have been able to produce. He stared at Amber, his face a mask of shock and awe. The mighty alpha king of the Iron Howl pack looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Amber was laughing, tears streaming down her face, her hand covering her mouth. The sight of him, so completely undone, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Your wolf is doing the thing again," she gasped out between peals of laughter. He blinked, the raw animal shock slowly receding as the human part of his brain caught up. He looked from the sock to her face, the truth finally settling, not just in his wolf's mind, but in his own. A slow, brilliant, world-changing smile spread across his face. He shot to his feet, the chair clattering backward onto the stone floor. In 2 long strides he was around the table. He didn't say a word. He just scooped her up into his arms, lifting her off her feet and holding her tight against his chest. "Let him," he said, his voice thick and choked with tears. He buried his face in her neck, his body shaking with silent, joyous laughter. "Let him howl all he wants." The news of the Queen's pregnancy did not spread like wildfire. It spread like a sonic boom. Sky's howl had been heard halfway across the castle. Within 10 minutes, Marcus was at their door, looking alarmed. He took one look at the king holding the weeping, laughing queen, saw the tiny sock still sitting on the dinner plate, and broke into the widest, most relieved grin Sky had ever seen on his face. Elara appeared behind Marcus a moment later. Apparently she'd been in the beta's quarters when the howl shook the walls, a detail neither she nor Marcus chose to explain, and which Sky and Amber chose not to ask about. The healer simply smiled, touched Amber's hand, and said, "I told you the spring would come." By morning, the entire kingdom knew. A wave of collective joy washed over the Ironhowl pack. The tension that had held the court in its grip for 2 years snapped, replaced by jubilant celebration. Servants hummed in the corridors. Guards stood a little taller. Even the mountain air seemed warmer. Elder Maeve, upon hearing the news, burst into tears and hugged Amber so tightly she almost cracked a rib. "I was a fool," the old wolf sobbed. "I was so afraid of the past, I almost ruined the future. Forgive an old woman's fear." Amber, touched by her genuine remorse, forgave her instantly. A package arrived from Sky's mother that afternoon. It was another embroidery hoop. Sky and Amber opened it together, holding their breath. Inside, stitched in triumphant, glittering gold thread that must have cost a fortune, were 4 simple words. "I told you so." They laughed so hard they had to hold on to each other for support. They hung it in a place of honor right over the hearth. The following spring, as the last of the snow melted from the highest peaks and the Whisper Creek ran full and clear through its new channel past the Badger burial grounds, Queen Amber gave birth. It happened at dawn, in their chambers, with the first light streaming through the balcony doors and the scent of the thawing mountain filling the room. Elara was calm and steady, her hands sure. Marcus stood guard outside the door, radiating anxiety so strong that every wolf in the corridor could smell it. Sky held Amber's hand and did not let go. Not when she cursed him, not when she laughed, not when she cried, not when she broke his 3rd and 4th fingers and didn't notice. And then there was a sound, small and furious and utterly, unmistakably alive, and Elara placed a squalling, red-faced, dark-haired baby boy into his mother's arms. Amber looked down at him. He was so small, so angry about being outside. His tiny fist was clenched, and his lungs were performing at a level Fury would have described as excellent capacity. She touched his cheek, and he stopped crying. Just like that, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this, the press of her finger, the sound of her heartbeat, the scent of home. "Neo," she whispered. The name had come to her in a dream weeks ago, and she'd held it close, waiting to see if it would still fit. It fit. They named him Neo. The kingdom celebrated for a week. The blessing of the hearth ceremony, so long delayed, was finally held. The entire pack gathered, in human form and wolf form, the younger ones shifting excitedly in the crowd, pups tumbling between legs, as Sky and Amber presented their son. The air was thick with joy and the scent of 1,000 happy wolves. Some weeks later, Sky was sitting in a rocking chair in the nursery, a room that had been aired out and filled with soft light and the smell of fresh linen. He held Neo in his arms. He was so small, so perfect. His tiny hand was wrapped around Sky's finger, the one Amber had broken during the birth, now healed but still tender, a fact that made him irrationally proud. He had never known a love like this, so fierce and so gentle all at once. Amber came and leaned against the back of the chair, her head resting on his shoulder. She looked down at their son, her face soft, with a contentment that seemed to radiate from her very bones. Sky felt a familiar presence stir in his head. Fury had been uncharacteristically quiet since the birth, seemingly in awe of the tiny new creature. But now the commentator was back on duty. "Okay, observation. He is perfect," Fury began, his voice filled with a comical degree of self-satisfaction. 10 fingers, 10 toes. Excellent lung capacity. A credit to the bloodline. Clearly, my regimen of positive visualization and posture correction was the decisive factor. I did this. Amber snorted softly, her warmth a familiar comfort against him. She could hear every word. From Tara, quiet and satisfied. "You did not do this." "Excuse me, I was instrumental." "You were loud. That is not the same thing." "Now, regarding his first shift," Fury continued, undeterred, "it is never too early to plan. I have drafted a comprehensive 37-point strategy. It begins with scent familiarization and progresses to controlled howling exercises. We must avoid the mistakes we made with you. Remember that time you accidentally shifted in the middle of your naming ceremony? Mortifying. We will not repeat history." Sky looked at Amber, a slow, happy smile spreading across his face. He had his mate. He had his son. His kingdom was safe and thriving. He had learned that love was not a duty, and a bond was stronger than any bloodline. He had learned what it meant to be a true partner. His wolf, on the other hand, had learned absolutely nothing. "He's got a plan," Sky murmured. "A 37-point plan," Amber corrected, her voice laced with laughter. "I particularly like the sound of controlled howling exercises." "He'll probably try to teach him about spite dams by age 2, Sky added. Neo stirred in his arms, making a soft, gurgling sound. Fury immediately went silent, all his attention focused on the tiny pup. A wave of pure, unadulterated adoration washed through the bond, so potent it made Sky's own heart ache with it. It poured through to Amber, and from Amber came Tara's quiet echo, a deep, wordless hum of completion, as if the frequency they'd both been reaching for had finally found its note. "He is magnificent," Fury whispered, all traces of coaching gone, replaced by simple awe. "Our pup." Sky leaned his head back against Amber's. The world was perfect. The pressure was gone, replaced by a love so vast it filled every corner of the mountain keep. And the chaos in his head, once a source of stress and frustration, was now just part of the beautiful, ridiculous music of his life. Somewhere in the castle, a teapot sat untouched on a silver tray. Nobody came to collect it. Nobody needed to.